Welcome to PianoInspires podcast, celebrating pianists, teachers, and innovators as they share their inspiring stories about the transformative power of music.
Hi, I'm Shana Kirk, and today our guest is George Litterst. George is a classically trained pianist. He completed his undergraduate work in music at Vassar College and subsequently earned his master's degree in piano at the New England Conservatory, where he taught as a member of the preparatory school for 22 years. In addition to performing on acoustic pianos, George is a MIDI musician. He works extensively with the high-tech Disclavier and Spirio pianos and other MIDI instruments in his teaching, performing, and other professional activities, including music software development. He is co-author of the interactive music display app SuperScore, the intelligent accompaniment software program Home Concert Extreme, the electronic music blackboard program Classroom Maestro, and the long-distance teaching and performance program Internet MIDI, all from Time Warp Technologies. Author of more than 100 articles on the application of new technologies in music education, George was a longtime board member and committee chair at the Francis Clark Center, a former associate editor for Clavier Companion magazine, and he co-authored the Tech Connect column for American Music Teacher. George lives with his wife, Helen, in Rehoboth, Massachusetts, and he is the 2023 recipient of the Francis Clark Center Lifetime Achievement Award. Welcome, George.
Thank you.
It's so wonderful to have you here. We've obviously known each other for a very long time.
Indeed.
And we've worked together in so many capacities, so it's really thrilling to get this opportunity to talk to you on an official level. So we're going to start at the beginning.
Okay.
The early years of George Litterst. How did music play a role in your childhood?
So I'll have to dig back farther than you know me, actually, from my childhood. Well, I was born to musical parents. My dad was a virtuoso, classically trained church organist, and my mother was a very fine violinist, and she had a career as both a violin and piano teacher. I grew up most of my life from age 5 onwards in Rockford, Illinois. Was a participant in handbell choirs and singing choirs at church, and was always taken to concerts as a young person with the mandate at the beginning of every concert. I had to recite the concert rules: do not talk, do not wiggle, just listen to the beautiful music. And so I got very focused on classical music early on. More popular genres were not smiled upon in our household. And so it wasn't until later years that my concept of high quality music were to expand, shall we say. But nonetheless, I had quite a lot of music background, but not a lot of rigorous piano training actually in my early years. And it was not until the 9th grade when I decided, I really want to do something here at the piano, and worked on it seriously with my father as my teacher. And then I went off to boarding school, St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire for 3 years. Studied piano there, but I have to say I was not a very good student. But I did sing in the church choir and was taken on trips to hear the Boston Symphony and so forth. Ended up at Vassar College, intending to major in political science and go to law school and have a political career. And as things turned out, music ended up becoming the big focus there. I had a wonderful teacher named Earl Groves, who spent lots of extra time with me. Why? Who knows? But boy, was he a dedicated teacher, and I discovered I could do things at the piano that I didn't imagine that I could do. And so little by little things started to change. I became a music major. And then it was, I think I'm going to do some graduate work in music and then go to law school. And then it was, I think I'm going to be a musician. And so somehow I wrangled away into New England Conservatory, studied with Jacob Maxson, and got a degree. Somehow it was titled Master of Music. I don't know how I could ever call myself a Master of Music. But that was the degree, and I was on the road at that point. So those were the earliest years. Shall I go forward?
Well, we can take a couple of different paths now, including obviously that led you to a path to deeply appreciating music from a lot of different directions, and then your transition between Rockford and New England. Obviously, that must have been quite a culture shock going from a smaller town to a big metropolis. So you became really, really enriched by a wonderful variety of musicians and some real leaders in music. Do you feel like music chose you?
Wow, that's hard to say, but it certainly resonated from the inside. There's no doubt about it. And there was an aspect to the whole thing that really segues into the educational part of my work, as a teacher, which was that having had to learn at the college level so many basic things that hadn't been trained well earlier on, I became very interested in the issues of how a person learns. And I became very introspective on myself. I remember my teacher in my junior year giving me the Mozart Concerto No. 9 to learn, and I couldn't do a trill to save my life. And one night I said, I'm going to sit in my practice room for an hour, and I'm going to figure out the mechanics of doing a trill. And I came up with a procedure that I wasn't going to be facile forever and ever from 1 hour of practice, but looking at the mechanics of the hands, seeing what one had to do and what you're going to do to train this over a period of time. And so I got very interested in the whole issues of learning and how the mind works. And that's had, of course, a deep influence on my work in technology.
So in my interactions with George Litterst, I have definitely observed that trait of incredible persistence. And that's really interesting for me to hear that this started at a level of finding your own technique as a pianist. And a lot of us had that experience, I think, and has impacted our teaching when we ourselves were a little aimless in our early training and then had to quickly catch up. And I think that really concentrates the way you approach learning any new topic, but especially one that requires so many different elements: your hands, your mind, your eyes, all the things at the same time. You really have to learn to isolate problems and figure them out in their tiniest elements.
There's another interesting wrinkle to that story, if we can pursue that path for a moment.
Go ahead.
Which is in 1980, I married a very beautiful woman named Helen Famayetti, who's now Helen Litterst. And she was formally trained as an educator, having gotten a degree in special ed at Boston College, and ultimately a degree in deaf education at Gallaudet in Washington, D.C. And so while she was not a musician, she was formally trained in the issues of how learning takes place and how language is acquired and so forth. And in our early years of marriage, I actually learned quite a lot about educational philosophy and understanding from her that had absolute applications to music education.
Oh, fascinating, because I think in that time, pedagogy was not normally taught in conservatories, right? You probably had no.
That's true. It was an uphill fight, I know, in the profession for those programs to get established. I will say, however, kind of embarrassingly on my part, that there was a wonderful musician at New England Conservatory named Gene Stackhouse, who is, I think, well known to the older group in NCKP, and she had started a piano pedagogy program that I arrogantly avoided when I was in school, because I just felt that, well, I need to make myself a better musician, and if I can learn how to do things, then of course I can teach them. And it was kind of a longer path to becoming a good teacher by having avoided that. But, there's karma possibly in this picture here. She became the chairman of the preparatory piano department at New England Conservatory and was my department chair. And I had
your employer for many years.
Yep. So I had an opportunity to become friends with her and to learn from her subsequently.
So we've heard about your influences, your teacher, Dr.
Earl Groves.
Earl Groves. Would you like to talk about anyone else who influenced you along this way?
Yes, and in fact, if you don't mind, I'd like to sort of talk about sort of the differences in the way that the influences took place.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, in the case of Earl Groves, he had the challenge of taking somebody who was struggling to play, let's say, a Beethoven sonata, who really wasn't ready to even start working on a Beethoven sonata, and say, how can I bring up this kid's skills and not discourage him by telling him he can't play this hard stuff? And so that was an interesting dynamic that I got from him. Now, when I got to graduate school and worked with Jacob Maxson, he was normally accustomed to working with talented students who already had a very good technique, and he could just focus on what you needed to do in the music. But with me, I needed to know more about the mechanics. How can I achieve what you're telling me to do? And so I ended up being the questioner. Every time he told me to do something, I wanted to know why, how. And it took him a while to kind of get used to this way of working with me, but ultimately, well, it's kind of funny to say it, but I was kind of pulling help out of him, but he was willing to let it come out, but he had to work with me in a way that he was not used to, which was very interesting. Then one summer I had an opportunity to study for 6 weeks with Walter Hautzig at the Hart School of Music in Connecticut, where he was usually in residence in the summer. And I took that same approach with him. I was only going to be with him for 6 weeks, and I wanted to get as much as I could out of him. And at first, he was a little taken aback, thinking that I was, questioning his wisdom in the lessons. And at the end, we had sat down for an evening and talked things over, and he realized I was really wanting good information that I could understand and take away and continue to use going forward. So those dynamics in the learning process have been a very interesting one.
So now we know how George became an excellent musician, but we don't know how you veered off into the wide world of technology. How did that path evolve?
Well, other good reasons to have married Helen Famiglietti, I guess. In 1984, she, in her teaching, thought she needed a computer so she could create worksheets for her students. And at the time, the computers were either the new Macintosh that had just come out that year, or the so-called IBM compatibles, or an Apple IIe. And she left it to me as the more technical person in the household to figure out what to do. And as I looked into things, I saw an ad for a piece of software called Professional Composer for the Macintosh. And I thought, well, gee, if we went the Mac route, there's going to be music software coming, and maybe there'd be something I could do with that later on. And that's why we got a Macintosh. And we borrowed money from her father in order to get it, and so forth. But the kicker was this program was going to cost $500, and I didn't have $500. I already owed my father-in-law for the computer. And 2 months after we got the computer, Apple came out with an upgrade for the Mac that cost $1,000. And this company said, and made an announcement and said, when this software comes out, it's going to require the upgraded computer. Now, to be able to finish this path was going to be $1,500. And so I was just so upset. I got to the end of the year, and I thought, well, these computers are going to last for a long time. Someday we're going to upgrade. I might as well just do the upgrade, get the tax deduction, and get it over with. So I went in and paid for the upgrade, and I saw a new magazine on the rack called Macazine, and the light went on, and I said to myself, if I could be writing software reviews for this magazine, this company will send me their $500 program for review. And one thing turned into another. I ended up writing a column for about 3 years called The Well-Tempered Macintosh. Everybody was sending me their software for review, and I got familiar with things. And boy, I'll tell you, in the early days, I struggled with some stuff that today is just so silly. The first Macintosh sequencer, I was reading the documentation, I had to write about this. What's the difference between a track and a channel? They seem like they're the same thing, but they're really not the same thing. And for me, the educational part of this was because I had to explain this to the readers. It was going through the process of explaining it to everybody else in the world that I finally got it.
Wow,
and
that's fascinating. I had no idea.
a good friend of mine named Jim Romeo, who regrettably died some years later from ALS, um, said to me, well, to be successful in a particular area, you really just need to know this much more than the next person. And I have to say, I think there's been a substantial portion of my career that's been a matter of just knowing this much more in the case of technology, and it's been a path to advancement.
And for podcast listeners, that this much was a very small amount. that air measurement was pretty small. I feel like I need to backtrack just a little bit because you had the light bulb come on that said you wanted to go write for a magazine, write reviews for a magazine. So at some point along the line, you've had some writing experience that was meaningful. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and this is a really interesting area with respect to technology and what the opportunities are for particular individuals. Writing was not an easy thing for me, and my handwriting was terrible. And so in school, writing papers was a very arduous thing to do. And eventually we had typewriters, and I had a big, in high school, Underwood typewriter with, keystrokes that go down about 3 inches, and my experience typing was terrible, using correctotype all over the place. I got to college, I had a little better typewriter, and my papers were all what I called one draft wonders. I would just take a bunch of notes, here's the order in which I'm going to do things, and I just would type away. And if my logic was out of order, there was no way I could go back and retype this. It was just too hard. But when we got a computer and a word processor, and you could backspace over things very easily, you could cut and paste and move paragraphs around and really sculpt your communication, all of a sudden I became facile with writing. And that's led to writing for lots and lots of different magazines and a couple of books and other things. But it was all facilitated by the technology. The capability was inside, but I couldn't get it out previously.
Wow, that is a really interesting perspective. I think we see that a lot with students, and I think that we're in a current time when meeting students where they are is such an important part of our philosophy as teachers, and recognizing that sometimes students or yourself have something embedded, and maybe a little tweak of technology or a little different format is all that is needed. And that's a fascinating thing to hear. So that's a challenge that you overcame and in fact turned it into a really instrumental asset of your career, a tipping point, if you will. Were there other challenges that you had to overcome?
Well, there's certainly have been a number of business challenges along the way, because inevitably if you start developing things with technology, you end up working with companies, and you may think you're on the same page with people, and you end up not being on the same page. But the commercial aspect of things has given a lot of facility to my my pathway, I should say. In brief, with my collaboration with this gentleman, Jim Romeo, that I mentioned, we developed an ear training program for the Mac early on called Ear Training Expert. And we took it to a company called Coda Music Software, which is the company that ultimately made Finale. And they were interested in us, and they saw the articles that I had written, and they asked us if we would like to write the documentation for this forthcoming software program called Finale. So that got me into that, and we had a $90,000 contract to write this documentation.
Wow.
We contracted to write 500 manuscript pages. In the end, we had to write 1,500 manuscript pages, and it still didn't cover every aspect of the program. This was a big thing that just ballooned out of control.
I can affirm I had that version of Finale, that early version, and I used that book for a doorstop. Sorry.
Well, there were things like nested dialogue boxes that were 19 layers deep in the program. I mean, a lot of challenges. But in any case, that got me connected with that company. And then a woman named Dr. Artis Wodehouse eventually came to them and said, I've got these MIDI files that have been converted from piano rolls that were recorded by George Gershwin. I'd like to get them notated, and Warner Brothers is ready to publish them, but I need help. And Coda assigned me as a consultant to work for her. That led us to a press conference sponsored by Yamaha in New York City, and suddenly I was with Paula Zahn on CBS This Morning with my big Mac 2 and music on the screen and papers coming out of the printer and disc-clavier piano with keys moving and whatnot. And that brought me to the attention of Yamaha, and I ended up having a 25-year run as a consultant with them that brought me to conferences and so forth. But the big thing for me in the late 80s and early 90s that has made a big difference for me was the emergence of the disc-clavier piano from Yamaha. Because now, with this new interest that I had in the computer and all the benefits I was personally achieving from technology, there was a gateway to the instrument that I wanted so badly to play and to give concerts on, the acoustic piano, and the disc-clavier connected. And so that became my focus for quite some time.
And that's probably about the time that I became aware of your work, not only with Yamaha, but with your own company. What made you decide, hey, I want to have a software company?
Well, funny things. I'm probably going to come across as a cheap person because you've heard my story about how I wanted to save $500 on a professional composer.
$500 was a lot of money. It would be a lot of money for a lot of us right now.
Well, I had a bigger issue, which was how am I going to get a disc-clavier for myself? And so I had to come up with a little scheme, and I contacted a magazine that I read voraciously called Piano Quarterly. It doesn't exist anymore. And I contacted the owner and editor and said, you need to have a 2-part article on the importance of modern reproducing pianos that have MIDI. And I'm the guy to write this for you, and it needs to be in 2 parts because there's so much to say. And I knew 2 parts meant that's 2 quarters, that's half a year. And so I could then go to Yamaha and say, I need you to loan me this disc-clavier so I can be doing things with it and so forth. So I ended up getting a couple of these instruments on loan, and eventually was able to buy one sort of on an insider deal with Yamaha and had one for myself. But I had to acquire the assets in order to go forward, and they were expensive.
So then how did that morph into Time Warp Technologies?
Oh, I didn't get to that part of the story. So the next thing was a couple of people at Yamaha got kind of fascinated with me, and I got sent to a conference. I think it was a World Piano Pedagogy Conference, or a name similar to that. It was kind of a conference that was filling in after the Richard Chronister conference era had come to a conclusion. And I met a guy named Mike Bates at Yamaha. And Mike had also brought in some other people who had been using Yamaha instruments and had a little panel discussion. And one person on that panel was a guy named Frank Weinstock. Now, in the context of writing my 2-part article for Piano Quarterly, I had found out that there was this guy at the College Conservatory at the University of Cincinnati named Frank Weinstock, who was working on some software that would enable you to practice a piano concerto and have a virtual orchestra follow you. And I had called him up on the phone and had conversations with him and so forth. And the last I had heard from him was that he was going to give up on that because another company had a patent on score following technology and said to him that if he tried to do anything with what he was developing, that they would sue him. And I told him on the phone, no, that can't be. We'll get another bigger partner who will fight them off, and they don't own this and whatnot. So anyway, I met Frank at that event, and he asked me, thinking that I must know what I'm talking about, which I didn't, well, would you like to partner with me on this? Because he's an academic, and he wasn't going to be a businessman, but I had a little more of that sense about me, and that forged a relationship. And out of that was Time Warp Technologies, which was first incorporated in 1997. And we had to work around the patent threat, which we did, and went forward.
So Time Warp has now evolved from that original score following, which I first experienced at a trade show or music conference, where a colleague pulled me over and said, "Oh my gosh, Shanna! Oh my gosh, you have to see what's happening here!" And there is a cursor going across the screen, following the score of a concerto. In fact, I think it was the Planets. I think it was a arrangement by Philip Kevrin. Cursor going across the screen. The piano is playing the orchestra part, and the pianist is speeding up and slowing down, and the orchestra is also speeding up and slowing down. And it was the most magical thing. And we were using laptops by then, but they were big, heavy laptops.
Yes.
And we were lugging around these things. And in fact, I believe, did we use 2 laptops because one needed to be used for
The visuals.
And we set it together with multimedia, and oh my goodness, that was so eye-opening. And when it finally came around, I was getting called. I was at that time just working as a student, kind of assistant to a Yamaha dealer that had Disclavier, and the owner of the store called me up and he said, "I'll buy you a plane ticket to go see this." And it turned out that it was just too late. I just couldn't even get a plane ticket to come and see it. But I had seen the pieces in action, and then all of these coming together for this really, really magical thing was so eye-opening for me and so inspirational. So I'll toss that ball to you as well. What is inspiring you in your life and work? Time Warp has become a much bigger company than those original days of software that came on a disc, or I guess it never came on a floppy disk, but it did come on a CD-ROM somewhere.
No, we had floppy disks.
It did come on a floppy disk at some point. So now Time Warp has many products, and Frank is still very involved.
Absolutely.
And there are more people very involved. And lots and lots of people around the country have, and in fact the world, have used your products, and not just products, but ideas and best practices, especially when distance learning became no longer a niche, right? So we could have a whole conversation about the history of distance learning as well. But we might do that on a different day. Suddenly, people like you and I went from being kind of the geeky people who thought distance learning was a cool thing to play with,
right,
to, oh my goodness, everybody needs this and we need it right now. And so that was a kind of breathless time for all of us to ramp up and see, kind of put our skills to the test. Is everything we've been experimenting with all of these many years actually going to work? Is it going to work for everyone in the way that we have made it work for us? And I think I can say, as an observer and participant, that a lot of people got incredible usefulness out of those years of experiments in distance learning, not only with MIDI, internet MIDI, but also just all of the ways that we plug things together. And so much of that was driven by you, George.
Well, can I make a couple comments on that?
Oh, absolutely.
It's true that the musicians' perspectives on technology have changed radically as a result of the pandemic. And it's also true that so much of what we offer from Time Warp today have their seeds and activities that go back into the 1990s, where it was difficult to have a conversation with another musician, because that's like, this technology stuff is just, what's that got to do with me?
Exactly.
And I have to tell you that a key issue for me has been all this time the opportunity to have really good people with whom to collaborate. And, you know, to have a person like a Frank Weinstock who can program brilliantly is one thing. The guy who's programmed internet MIDI, named George Touchstone, he's an old-time fiddle player of all things, so you're not going to see him at this conference of piano teachers. But having those collaborations and finding key people who could get the vision, who had the vision and the passion to work with, and gave me a sense that you know, there's a reason to keep doing this. And I'll tell you that you were a big part of that picture as well, as an early adopter and then ultimately a collaborator on so many levels here. And if there weren't people who were excited about these ideas early on, I don't know if we had gotten to this point.
Thank you, George. It's been an honor and a pleasure collaborating with you all of these many years, and so many others around us too. I feel that we have started with a tiny core of like-minded, but quirky individuals who
Quirky for sure.
very quirky individuals who had a passion for kind of quirky things, and we have really built a community around it that is much broader than when we began. So it's been really quite a pleasure for me as well.
And I would just add one further thought to that, which is that I, more than any of the people in the group, have had the largest number of opportunities to take bows for all of this. And so much of the accolades end up being focused in my direction, but it's definitely shared experiences for sure.
So as I'm kind of listening to you today and kind of reflecting on our history as collaborators and colleagues, a few things are a few things repeat, a few themes, if you will. And so our little motifs that we find over and over in the life of George Litterst are passionate persistence. There is another one that you kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, which was always asking why. So
Absolutely.
This just incredible deep curiosity that is childlike in so many ways. And we've had this conversation before that, we sometimes train the curiosity out of children, and it's much better if we don't. And it's also challenging in many ways if we don't, but endless curiosity. And then finally, a generosity, which is what you just exhibited, generosity that is always sharing the credit and often taking way more time and way more effort than would be expected of someone who asks you a simple question, and then you find them in the corner later still hovering over two computers, and so much generosity to make sure anyone who asks a question gets it answered thoroughly, sometimes a week or two later, but always with incredible thoroughness. What's the future of George Litterst? And not just the future of George Litterst, how are you and your work changing the world? And I'll say another question as well to encompass that, which is, what impact is music having on the world?
Okay. Well, there's quite a number of questions in there. I'll first start by saying that the basic work of enabling and assisting the community of musicians to take advantage of the technologies that we currently have is really far from over. It's true that because of the pandemic, people had to suddenly start doing things that they didn't do before and got out of their comfort zone and got used to making better use of computers and things like that. But I think that their use has been still rather narrowly focused, and we have a long path to go still to connect teaching to what's actually happening when you're playing the instrument, to the learning process. And all of which is to say that the things that we've developed up to this point, I don't think are yet fully exploited. And so there's a lot of work to be done just to evangelize what we have done to this point. A lot of my focus today is on an application that we have called SuperScore, which is an interactive platform for the delivery of sheet music in digital formats. And it's unique in the sense that the notation display itself is liquid. You can resize it, and it gets literally re-engraved on the fly, which makes a big difference for the person. That one person needs to be able to have help discriminating between lines and spaces, and they need big size. Somebody else can able to look at groups of notes and realize what the harmony is and what the horizontal patterns are, and they need to see more music at a time. So we do this at a publication quality, and I think we're the only ones currently who've achieved that. Thanks, of course, to Frank Weinstock.
Well, I should point out, SuperScore is an iPad app.
Yes. And it has interactivity directly from a MIDI capable instrument, much of those qualities you talked about with home concert. And what is driving me musically with that is my engagement with composers, arrangers, and publishers who produce the content. Because it's not just the technology by itself that's worth anything, it's how does it fit into people's creative lives, and it's a vehicle for putting forward content. And not only contemporary content, but we're using it to bring new life to works of the past, and especially works that have been unjustly forgotten. One of my most interesting recent publications has been the 12 Country Dances of Ignatius Sancho, a man who composed in the 1870s, who was born on a slave ship in the 1720s. Has a remarkable story, ends up growing up as a slave in England, finds a way to get emancipated, becomes a property owner. He's the first person of African descent to vote in a parliamentary election. And somehow, and it's not known where and how, he developed some musical skills and composed 5 publications of music.
That element of superscore has been one of the most fascinating to me. Just the breadth of composers, arrangers, content producers, teachers, authors of instructional materials. Tell us a little bit more about the people you've worked with in the Superscore library.
Well, one of my dearest colleagues that I work with quite a bit is a man named Paul Sheftel, who I know you know.
One of my dearest friends as well.
And he's a very interesting person to dwell on here for a moment, because we're living in fast-changing times, and so many individuals and companies don't know how to adjust for fast-changing times, and they often really lose practical value in their assets because they can't migrate from old to new. In the case of Paul, he was composing and arranging in the 1960s and 70s in the era of print. And then when the late 80s and early 90s came, he migrated to MIDI accompaniments that added an extra dimension to his work. And of course, they had to be delivered on a floppy disk, and you had to have a special keyboard to put the disk into. But when the computer era arrived in the later part of the 1990s into the early 2000s, well, he shifted his focus over to actually one of our software products, Home Concert Extreme, and now his music was available in that medium. And then again, when Superscore emerged, he's been able to migrate over to a fully contained interactive environment where all the best aspects of print are intertwined with the best aspects of MIDI playback and educational interactivity. And you can see he's just this continual transformation, which everybody should learn from.
Absolutely. Paul's one of the most inspiring people in our community in general. And I should also mention that he was a longtime keyboard editor for Carl Fisher Publishing, which was a very weighty job that carried a lot of pedagogy in terms of providing high quality collections of standard literature, in addition to his own composing. So to have that combination of historic accuracy and historic respect in our music context, and be forward thinking in writing music, and be forward thinking in providing music in new and different formats, I think it's not just a technology question, it's kind of a philosophical question. That we are providing music in so many different ways and so many different directions while still honoring music of the past for its value and history. And now to have a technology platform to be able to go back and find and make available even more music of the past that has been neglected. The music of Luis Ferenc on the Superscore platform I was exploring recently. Beautiful stuff. Almost no one has ever heard. There's a Clara Schumann piece that's in Superscore that's beautiful and rarely played. All of the Sancho collection is so much fun and very accessible to students. So there's such a wide range and really a limitless aspect to this. And it's so exciting to have things available to share around to our students and to the public without really any impediments, except for the fact that it's on an iPad. So we do have to encourage people to use iPads for that purpose.
But to get to the other part of your question about what drives me musically, SuperScore has provided an outlet for me, because you mentioned, for instance, the Louise Farranc publications. Well, that gives me a reason to learn the music myself, and I ended up recording those scores, and so my performances are there in SuperScore. And so in addition to the software development work and the teaching and public performing, this is giving me a chance to learn a wider variety of literature, record it for posterity. Hopefully it's of use to somebody, and that really connects me, the performing musician, back into this technology work.
So it's all full circle. It's all full circle. You began as a serious performer. You began being told to not wiggle in a concert. And then actually you may have done a lot of wiggling to get to a point of technology, going pretty far from that very serious focused path. And then now you have come all the way back around to it.
And the circle will be fully closed when I get a chance to appear on stage again in a multimedia concert with a Shana Kirk.
Those were some fun performances for sure. Okay, final question. How does piano inspire you?
Well, it's just the nature of music performance. It's just such a complete whole person experience. The physicality of it, the objectives in the performance, the response to the sound that you make, the sense of communication with an audience. I mean, this was all stuff I was talking about in my session about how do the teachings of Francis Clark inform our uses of technology. I really think that music making is the most unique, complete human experience that there is, that you can't compare it to anything else. And what a better world the whole world would be if everybody was at least doing a little bit of music making.
Well, we couldn't have ended with a more hopeful and inspiring note. Thank you so much, George.
Well, thank you, Shanna.
We look forward to more conversations in the future and many, many exciting days to come. And again, congratulations on receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Francis Clark Center. It's so well deserved.
Thank you.
The Francis Clark Center is a not-for-profit educational organization that serves the advancement of piano teaching, learning, and performing. Divisions include Piano Magazine, PianoInspires Kids, Journal for Piano Research, National Conference on Keyboard Pedagogy, the New School for Music Study, Piano Education Press, International Online Teacher Education, and PianoInspires Online Community Hub. Please visit us at pianoinspires.com to learn more about our impactful work and inspiring community.